right. Welcome, folks. It is springtime. We're starting another set of 3 lectures tonight. The first one of the spring is on Lorenzo de' Medici of Florence, 1449 to 1492. I told people I was going to give you another reason to remember 1492, because to me, this is almost more important than any other thing associated with that date. And we have some images of him because he was a great patron of the arts. And so Verrocchio, Bronzino, and that one is Italian school, meaning we don't know which workshop it came out of. But almost everybody who was a contemporary and wrote a description of him all agreed he had a big, ugly nose. And apparently he was not offended if the artist depicted it relatively close to lifelike. We'll see. Yeah, so welcome. Have to show you this. This is actually with a hat tip to a website called Royalty Now Studios. They take historic figures and it's a little bit of AI and a little bit of their own tweaking, and they try and portray them if they were alive in the 21st century, what would they look like? So this is Lorenzo and his brother, his younger brother, Giuliano. They were the only 2 sons of their father, and so they were the heirs to the family fortune, the family palace, the family business, and these are sort of AI cleanups of historical images that we actually do have, and then this is, well, if they were 21st century Italian businessmen, what would they look like? Which I think is kind of clever. It helps us humanize them a bit. So a bit about the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. Founded in 2004, so we're going on 23 years now. Our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art, and it is named for the influential theologian and apologist, Francis Schaeffer, who was one of the great theologians of the 20th century. There are some pictures of our students. There's a picture of me with a group of students in Rome in front of one of Raphael's frescoes. So we do go on field trips every now and then. So in addition to sponsoring this lecture, we offer a high school program built around an integrated chronological study of Western civilization. We'll begin with the ancient world in 9th grade and finish with the 20th century in the 12th grade. And we are accepting applications now for students to join us in the fall. It's a university model program, meaning we hold classroom meetings 1 day a week. So on Wednesdays, we all gather here in this building, and the students have lectures with a historian and a teacher of literature and an art historian, and they're all focused on one time period. So they get 3 hours of instruction on 3 different facets for each time period, and all the students do that course program together. So if you know somebody that might be interested in that kind of a study, send them to our website, send them to me. If you're seeing this on YouTube, then there should be links that you can click to actually get to more information about the school. I am Rob Shearer. I'm co-director along with my wife, Cindy. We've been married for 48 years. We have 12 children, 3 sons, 9 daughters. We have 22 grandchildren at this point. And my background, undergraduate at Davidson College, I majored in history and German, and a graduate degree at Stanford out on the left coast, where I majored in history and humanities. So I've been a historian for all of my adult life, but I've bounced around a number of other interesting little sidetracks from time to time. In addition to being a college professor, I was city manager here in Mount Juliet from 2000 to 2007. My wife and I have a little publishing company, Greenleaf Press, and we sell our books through Amazon. And I am the director, co-director of the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. So as is traditional, tell me something you already know. about Lorenzo de' Medici? Florence, yes, yes. The Medici family are associated with Florence, the House of Medici. He's probably the most famous member of the family, but certainly not the one who is responsible for its wealth and fame, and not the last one in the line. Yeah, Renaissance Italy. He is the height of the Renaissance, second half of the 15th century. All right, well, we'll tell you more. Here's a fun little fresco that's actually done about 150 years after he died. It is Lorenzo surrounded by artists in the sculpture garden at his palace. On the left, there are three humanists that we can sort of identify. Alberti, Leon Battista Alberti, who's a famous architect and humanist. Michelozzo di Borromeo is this fellow here with the yellow shirt. Bertoldo di Giovanni, who is a sculptor in the back here and was a pupil of Donatello. And that's Lorenzo in the center, you can tell, because he's always dressed in this crimson cape and the red headdress. And over here on the right-hand side of the painting is one of the star pupils at the Medici School for Artists, who is presenting him with his very first bit of sculpture, the first time he'd ever taken hammer and chisel to a block of marble. This is Michelangelo, who had completed as his very first work a copy of a Greek statue called the Head of a Faun. And Lorenzo's admiring the young Michelangelo. I'll say more about him later on. But that gives you a picture. This was sort of Tuesday at the Medici Palace. This is like every day. These artists all lived in the palace. And there was a school for artists. In addition, they taught them the works of classical literature. They trained them in the languages of Greek and Latin. There was a salon. He had writers and philosophers at the table at lunch every day. It's just an astonishing place. So our main sources of information, we're now into early modern times, so a lot has been preserved. Lorenzo himself left a large body of letters, things that he had written himself, diplomatic dispatches, and personal poetic works. He wrote poetry. He wrote poetry copiously, in all different styles. There are family letters and documents, his parents, his children, and other relatives. Many have been published and translated, mostly in Italian, but some in classical Latin. At his death, there was an inventory made of the Palazzo Medici, which details his collection of arts, antiquities, and manuscripts. So we know the kinds of things that he had purchased, or that he had inherited because his father had purchased them. There are poems about him and some anecdotal accounts by his circle, Angelo Poliziano, Marsilio Ficino, and other humanists and poets who were for whom he was a patron. Other primary sources, Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli wrote a history of Florence, among other things, and deals extensively with Lorenzo. He overlaps Lorenzo's life a little. He was a young man when Lorenzo was at the end of his career, but he had access to all of this historical material from the city. He retired to the countryside, and he spent some of his retirement years writing up a history of the city and included a lot of information about Lorenzo. The famous Italian historian Francesco Guicciardini wrote a history of Italy and then a separate multi-volume history of Florence. Poliziano, we've mentioned earlier, he was a contemporary. He wrote letters and poems, including a famous letter describing Lorenzo's death. He was present at the villa in the countryside when Lorenzo passed away. Secondary sources. Well, we have some good biographies. This one from the late 1700s is actually still authoritative, although he tends to be a little bit fawning. He wants to actually want everyone to know that Lorenzo deserved the appellation magnificent. Christopher Hibbert, this one from 1980. This is still quite readable and still a very good source. It includes chapters not just on Lorenzo, but on his great-grandfather who founded the bank, his grandfather who took the bank to huge successes, his father, and then Lorenzo, and then his children, and his grandchildren who went from being just citizens of Florence, commoners. It was considered to be, you made yourself ineligible to serve in the government of the Republic of Florence if you had a title of nobility. So nobody wanted one. And the Medici didn't have one until Lorenzo's grandchildren finally decided that, okay, they would accept the title of Duke of Tuscany. And so that family, and there are living descendants, actually, of the Medici family. I ran across an auction by one of the members who was selling off a number of antiquities and coins and jewelry and things, none of which I could afford. But I enjoyed reading the catalog. 2004 is a very good analysis of Lorenzo as a patron of the arts. He wasn't just someone who gave money. He actually critiqued and trained and commissioned individual works of art, told the artist exactly what he wanted. And so this is Lorenzo de' Medici and the Art of Magnificence, which talks about how he acquired that title with particular attention to his association with the artists of the Renaissance. And then the most recent biography, 2008, The Brilliant Life, Magnifico, The Brilliant Life and Violent Times of Lorenzo de' Medici. This one's in print. It's quite well written and very detailed. If you want to know a whole lot more about Lorenzo, this is about 400 pages, 430 pages of just the life of Lorenzo de' Medici. It's a good book. But if you want just an introduction, I'd recommend the Hibbert. It's probably one of my favorite on the family. So, geography and genealogy. We got to do geography and genealogy. You can't understand any historical figure. This is my repeated litany. Anytime I want to sit down and analyze somebody, I want to find out what are the circumstances, what's going on, where are they physically located, what are the boundaries of the political entities that they grow up in, and then I want to know about their family. I'm a huge fan of Wordsworth's aphorism, who said, "The child is father to the man." If you want to understand the adult personality of a historical figure, find out as much as you can about their childhood, because it will explain who they were as an adult. So I want to try and give you both of those things. And let's start with the political situation. There was no nation of Italy. This is the other thing. It's hard for Americans to get their heads wrapped around. We think of ourselves as a young nation and the European nations as old and having centuries and centuries of history. That's not really true. I mean, the cities and the locales, yes, are ancient, go back to Roman times. But as an integrated nation state, there is no Italy until 100 years after the American Revolution. Italy as a united country does not come into existence until the 1870s. So it had, and of course it's not in the ancient world, it's not the Italian empire, it's the Roman Empire. The city of Rome conquered the other cities on the peninsula and then gave them generous terms, demanded taxation, but let those cities sort of run their own local affairs as long as they contributed to Roman wealth, prestige, and especially Rome's military units. They were allowed to be sort of semi-autonomous. Now, Rome controlled foreign policy. If the city of Rome went to war, all of the cities of Italy went to war with Rome. But it was definitely an empire run by a city, not by a country. So when Rome was sacked and collapsed at the end of the empire, at the beginning of the barbarian Middle Ages, those cities spun off and had their own independent local rulers. And by the early 1400s, there are 5 major cities that kind of divide up the Italian peninsula. They're actually probably more like 30 or 40 independent cities, but these are the 5 most important ones, the 5 most powerful ones. Sort of going from south to north, the Kingdom of Naples, which is about the southern half of the peninsula. And then the Pope actually controls a huge territory that stretches all the way across the band of the peninsula from the Mediterranean side to the Adriatic, and includes multiple other cities. He rules in Rome, but he collects taxes from a dozen other cities in a territory that's called the Romagna. It includes important cities like Ravenna and Bologna. They're controlled by the Pope. And the Pope actually has an army. He has his own captain general, and he sometimes gets involved in wars with other city-states. Going north then, Florence, Milan, and Venice kind of divide up the northern, hello. Yeah, there we go. Divide up the northern part of the peninsula. Whoops. Come on. Why am I going backwards? I'm just going backward on that screen. There we go. Now we're, okay. Well, come on now. I think I'm frozen there. Let's see here.
Try turning it off and back on again.
Yeah. I broke the internet. Lorenzo, there we go. It's the problem with having a touchpad. If you touch it when you don't mean to, then strange things happen. Okay, here we go. Did all that. There we go. Yes, Milan and Florence were at war with each other in the 1430s 3 times. There's war between Milan and Florence. This is in the era of Lorenzo's grandfather, Cosimo. The Sforza, Francesco Sforza displaced the Visconti in Milan in 1450. Fall of Constantinople in 1453. Interestingly enough, those 2 things sort of lead to peace in Italy. In 1454, the various cities negotiate their own treaties, largely because they're alarmed at what has happened in the East. They're alarmed because Constantinople was conquered by the Muslims, was conquered by the Ottoman Turks. So suddenly Italy feels a little vulnerable, and all these cities have been squabbling with each other, go, we might have another threat. We probably should stop fighting with each other. We probably ought to think about defending ourselves because they might be headed our way. So they get a remarkable peace that begins in the mid-century. Here are the 5 major, again, from south to north. Here's Naples and the Kingdom of the 2 Sicilies. Here's Rome, and I mentioned that band of territories that stretches across the Apennines to the Adriatic and all the way up to Bologna. Here's the Republic of Florence. Here's the Duchy of Milan and the Republic of Venice, which is not just the island at the head of the Adriatic, but also controls a lot of territory on the mainland, including Padua. Whoops. Here we go. All right. Background. Lorenzo's grandfather is where we have to start. His grandfather is Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo de' Medici is probably best known as the one who perfected branch banking and became the banker to the Pope. And branch banking basically means there were members of the Medici family who moved to the major commercial centers in Europe, set up a small establishment. None of the branches ever employed more than about 9 or 10 people. But it was a huge convenience for merchants trying to conduct business at geographically separated points, because if, for instance, you were going to go to Belgium and purchase wool to ship back to Florence where it could be made into cloth, and then you wanted to take the cloth and transport it, you had to transport the finished goods and the raw materials, but the money to complete those transactions, that became a logistical nightmare. Because how are you going to take bags of gold with you over the Alps and through the countryside? So instead of taking bags of gold on the backs of mules across the Alps and through the countryside, you would take them to the Medici house in Florence and deposit them. They would write you out a receipt, which was more than just a little receipt on a piece of paper. They gave you a bit of parchment that was drafted by a notary and then signed and stamped with the Medici family seal. And you take that piece of parchment with you and you take it to the Medici house in Antwerp. And you present it to the house there, and you had 1,000 golden florins that you had deposited in Florence, and you would like to have those 1,000 golden florins so you could take them to the market in Antwerp and buy wool. And then if you had any money left, you could take it back to the Medici bank, get another little piece of parchment out, and take it with you back to Florence. Of course, there was a small fee. But, and we're talking 0.5%, 1%. But a very small percent of a large number is still a big number. And the Medici, of course, had their overhead was almost nothing. They didn't ship gold either. They just exchanged letters. So that deposits and withdrawals tended to balance. They were not the only family in Florence that went into banking, though. They had rivals. And in 1433, there was a feud between the Abruzzi family and the Medici family. Think Hatfields and McCoys. They both had big palaces. They were both wealthy. They had rival banks. And Cosimo had, in their view, gotten too big for his britches, and they wished to eliminate him. So the Abruzzi went around and talked to all the other wealthy merchants in Florence, and they all agreed that Cosimo had to go. They had him arrested, and Ronaldo wished to have him executed, but the people of Florence staged a huge demonstration in front of City Hall. And so eventually he realized that this was going to lead to conflict and reprisals and possibly fighting in the street. And so he compromised, and they simply banished Cosimo for 10 years to a town outside, and he was only gone for 2. And he came back in 1435 in triumph, and the Abruzzi had to go into exile. So yeah. One of the other significant events that Cosimo, and this is Lorenzo's grandfather, that Cosimo pulled off, is the threat to Constantinople was already brewing and very much on the minds of the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. He was looking for military assistance from all of the Western European powers, and they needed to get an agreement with the Pope. Hopefully they get agreement with the Italian cities. Maybe they could get the King of France and the Emperor to participate. So they agreed to come to Italy for a church conference to settle the theological disputes. The Pope and the Patriarch of the Eastern Church had excommunicated each other in the 11th century, largely over what was the proper text of the Nicene Creed. In the West, there was a word that had been added. In the East, they thought that was highly presumptuous. And so the Eastern Patriarch denounced the Western Church as heretical and presumptuous, and the Western Church denounced the Eastern Church as heretical and presumptuous, and they excommunicated each other. So they needed to solve that problem, and so they have a church council. So the Eastern Emperor and the Patriarch came to Italy with a delegation of 700, mostly bishops and nobles from the Eastern Empire. And Cosimo went, this is an opportunity. And so he persuaded the Pope and the Eastern delegation to come to Florence with the promise that he would pay their expenses. And they did. They came to Florence, and it was a spectacular display for the city. They did reach an agreement. They reunited. Basically, the West gave up nothing, and the East said, okay, fine, we forgive you. And when the Eastern Emperor and the Patriarch went back to Constantinople, everybody greeted them with a, wait, what? You agreed to what? No, we reject that agreement. And 14 years later, the Turks conquered Constantinople. But it was one of the consequences of that conference being held in Florence, though, is that one of the archbishops, the Archbishop of Nicaea, was persuaded to remain in Florence, and he had brought manuscripts with him of not just early versions and texts of the New Testament, but also some texts of the Greek philosophers. And more importantly, in the West, it was still, even in the 1400s, it was still rare to find anyone who was really conversant with Greek as a language. Greek was almost like Egyptian hieroglyphs would be for us. People recognized it, but they couldn't read it or make sense of it. So Archbishop Bessarion actually began teaching at the university in Florence, teaching Greek, and spending time with Cosimo. Cosimo learned to read Greek, something that previous generations had not had the ability to do. Cosimo, in fact, founded his own think tank, headquartered, of course, in his palace, called the Platonic Academy, and hired a young humanist who was a gifted scholar, especially in languages, commissioned him to translate the complete works of Plato into Latin. It's Marsilio Ficino and the Platonic Academy. And Florence rapidly, within a matter of just a few years, gained a reputation as being the one place in Europe where Greek was being properly taught. And all the scholars in Europe who wanted to learn how to read Greek went to Florence to learn, including scholars from Oxford and Cambridge in England, scholars from the German universities, all went to Florence. Erasmus went to Florence to perfect his Greek. Cosimo provided the funds for the baptistry doors. Some of you guys were admiring some of the shots over here. Lorenzo Ghiberti got the commission to do new doors for the baptistry in the piazza in front of the cathedral. They're gorgeous. There's a little small, we need a full page blow up on them, but Cosimo paid for this. And it was a pretty sum. He spent 20 years doing the first 10 panels, and then 20 plus years doing another 10 panels. Cosimo provided the funds for the completion of the dome. They had built this huge cathedral with a huge open area above the altar where there was an open space. It was open to the sky for 30 years, and no architect actually understood well enough how to build the dome. They had built arches for years using wooden centering. You build a wooden scaffold, and you complete the arch, and then you take the scaffolding down. The problem is the Duomo starts 250 feet above the floor of the church, and it's going to go up another 150 feet above that. It's a 40-story building. And they quickly calculated there were not enough trees in Tuscany to build in the wooden scaffolding that would be required if they had to do it that way. So another great artist, scholar, student of the ancient art had gone to Rome and done an architectural study of the Pantheon. And he came back to Florence and said, I know how to build it. And they said, oh, really, how? I said, no, if I tell you, then everybody will say they know how. So give me the commission and I'll build it. And they did. Cosimo provided the funds. He provided the funds for the rebuilding of the monastery of San Marco. I'll talk about that a bit more. It's a very influential Dominican monastery in town. He actually had the architect design an extra set of rooms that were dedicated to him for his personal use. And over the course of the years, he would several times a year do his own sort of spiritual retreat and go and live with the Dominican monks for a couple of days. And of course, he paid an artist, Fra Angelico, to do a fresco on the wall of each monk's cell, including his, although his selection for his cell is quite interesting. He actually asked the painter to do a painting of the Adoration of the Magi. And he said he deliberately wanted that scene because it showed the Magi as wealthy traveling merchants who were taking off their crowns and laying them at the feet of the infant Jesus. And he wanted that on the wall in his cell. Interesting guy. Commissioned a new Medici residence. If you go to Florence now and visit the Medici Palace, the Medici had not always lived there. Cosimo is the one who selected the site and built it. He expanded the bank. Eventually, during his tenure as the head of the family, there were branch offices in London, Naples, Cologne, Geneva, Lyon, Avignon, Bruges, Antwerp, Lübeck, Bologna, Rome, Pisa, and Venice. And of course, very significantly, because the church is collecting money from all over Europe, you could take the amount of money that was being remitted to Rome, and instead of sending it on pack mules across the Alps, you would take it to the local Medici bank, and they would send a letter to the bank in Rome, and the Pope would have the money for a small fee. Cosimo is a patron of the great artists of the first generation: Donatello, Fra Filippo Lippi, Fra Angelico. I could do a lecture about each of those. The Botanic Institute we've talked about. Marsilio Ficino is the director. So let's do the life of Lorenzo now. This is the grandson of Cosimo. And in 5 acts, his youth, he's born in 1449, comes of age at the age of 20, 1469. In that year, he is suddenly the head of the family. His father had died, or his grandfather had died 5 years before, and his father died then in 1469. And Lorenzo, at the age of 20, is now the head of the Medici family and the head of the bank. And 9 years after, he's still in his late 20s, he is the target of an assassination attempt, which sort of rocks not just the city of Florence, but the whole Italian peninsula, and indeed all of Europe is set ablaze. It's an assassination attempt that fails, but it has incredibly important implications. After that, after surviving that, he is presiding over Florence's golden age, 1479 to 1492. So for about 13 years, Florence really reaches its apex in terms of culture and art and learning and influence throughout the world. And then he dies actually young. He dies at only 43? Yeah, 43 years old. So, youth and education. His father is Piero de' Medici. His grandfather is Cosimo. They're both alive as he's growing up. They both see to his education. They both involve him in the business transactions from about 14 or 15 on. He's apprenticing at the bank. But his mother was also a very learned woman. She wrote poetry that we have, and she made sure that he received the finest education in the liberal arts. His tutors, Gentile Becci, Cristoforo Ladino, and Ficino, the head of the Botanic Institute, is one of the tutors of the young Lorenzo. So he's getting the cream of the crop. At age 17, he went to intern as bank branch, or with the bank branch manager in Rome. That's the most important of the branch banks. He had already been sent, even at 16, on diplomatic missions to Pisa, Milan, Bologna, Venice, and Naples. Those were the other cities in Italy. So he knew the geography of Italy. He knew the political leaders of each of these other cities. He had a very keen grasp of the geographic and political realities of the world that he lived in. In 1466, Medici rivals plotted to overthrow his father, and that was thwarted. At 20, he was described as strong, virile, clever, inexhaustibly energetic, and strikingly ugly. Yeah, the broken nose. It not only was a big nose, at some point it got broken, and it was never quite right. He was competitive at athletic sports. He enjoyed hunting, hawking, rioting, singing, and, of course, wenching. He told jokes. He was actually rather renowned for his sense of humor, and he played pranks on his friends, including, somebody gets too drunk and passes out, and they would very carefully wrap him up in a blanket and take him outside the city somewhere and leave him in a field and then hide in the bushes and watch. He did have a rare gift for friendship. His friends remained extremely loyal to him and he to them, and he was very generous. He was devoted to his horses. We know he loved animals. He actually, his own horse, he deliberately didn't delegate this to a servant. He went and fed his horse every day. And then the horse wouldn't eat until Lorenzo came and brought him the oats. And if Lorenzo was late, the horse got very agitated. He got married in 1469. He had 3 sisters and a brother. There were 5 children total. His 3 sisters all did the traditional Florentine wealthy family practice of marrying into other wealthy Florentine cities. But for Lorenzo, they did something different. They broke the pattern. His parents arranged a marriage to the daughter of one of the leading families in Rome, the Orsini. And this had both advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantages, a lot of the other families in Florence were a little bit insulted because they had all hoped for the hand and hoped for the relationship with the Medici. But the advantage of them was they were now allied with another very powerful family in Italy, the Orsini. Clarice, daughter of one of the wealthiest, most influential families of Rome. And of course, they had a month-long festival and tournament in Florence with jousting and public performances. Everybody sent gifts. He got a white charger from the King of Naples, a black charger from the Duke of Ferrara, and a polished suit of armor from the Duke of Milan. And he competed in the tournament and, of course, was declared the victor of all the jousts. And I'm sure there was no favoritism shown by the judges. Yeah. There were 5 banquets at the Medici Palace. I won't go through the long list. We actually have the inventory of what they purchased for this extravaganza. The one statistic that amused me was 300 barrels of wine, because they set up at least a dozen long tables in different parts of the palace, probably had 300, 400, 500 guests for 5 nights in a row with entertainment, musicians, bands, jesters. Yeah, it was crazy. So by 1469, though, he suddenly becomes the head of the family. His grandfather died in 1464 when Lorenzo was 15. That's Cosimo. And then his father, I don't know what you have to do to earn the nickname, the Gouty, but you can imagine. He died in 1469 at the age of 53. Lorenzo was 20, and he's now the head of the family, which is a remarkable responsibility. And of course, the rivals are all looking over going, this might be our opportunity to bring about the downfall of the Medici. They've got a 20-year-old kid. What is he going to know about running the banking business or keeping control of political arrangements in the city? This might be our chance. It takes a while, but they do eventually make their move. Here's the genealogy again. Cosimo de' Medici, he had been granted the title Pater Patriae by the city council in Florence. It's father of the country, actually father of the fathers. Piero is his father, and here's Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano. And then his 3 sons, he said the first one was stupid, the second one was clever, and the third one was good. The stupid one managed to get the Medici overthrown and expelled from Florence, and then died accompanying the French army on campaign. The clever one wound up being elected pope, and the good one was a cardinal and assisted his older brother. His son took the name Pope Leo X and is supposed to have said, when he was elected pope, to his younger brother, God has given us the papacy. Let us enjoy it. People now dispute whether he actually said that, but it's too good a story not to repeat. One of his descendants becomes Queen of France, Catherine de' Medici. You might have heard of her. She doesn't have a very good reputation. All right, 1478, the Medici rivals make their move. The Pazzi family. rival bankers, also an old prosperous family. One of the sons, Francesco de Pazzi, is the branch manager in Rome, and he starts poking around for allies to make a move to do Lorenzo in, to end the Medici Bank, get rid of the Medici forever. He teams up with Girolamo Riario, who is a nephew of Pope Sixtus IV, who had just been given territory that the Pope had bought for him to rule. And he doesn't like the Medici either. And then Francesco Salviati is a major ally of the Pazzi. He actually is a churchman. He had been appointed Archbishop of Pisa, but the city of Florence had a long-standing arrangement with the papacy in Rome. Pisa was part of the territory controlled by the city of Florence. It's one of the neighboring cities, and they consider it their possession. And their agreement was that the Pope would not appoint an archbishop for that city without the permission of the city of Florence. If they got a veto, they could approve. And the Pope appointed Salviati without any consultation at all. And so the city fathers in Florence banned him, refused to allow him to come to Pisa. And he'd been waiting about a year. He's like, okay, we got to get rid of the Medici, or I'm never going to be able to assume this office. And it was, he had borrowed money to pay the Pope to be appointed, and he needed the income from the office in Pisa in order to pay back the loans that he had borrowed, so he was under lots of pressure. And they decided, the three of them, well, the only way to be sure that we overthrow the Medici is to murder Lorenzo and Giuliano simultaneously. And they actually went to the Pope to consult with him about this plan, and the Pope was very cagey and wouldn't actually commit himself, but kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, sure, go ahead. I'll make it all right after the fact. And they said, oh, but don't kill anybody. And they went, well, how are we going to do it? Just, I don't want to know about it. Just don't kill anybody, but come see me after you've killed people, and I'll work it all out for you. So they tried first, when the Medici are out at one of their country estates, they go, well, can we invite them to dinner at a neighboring estate? Because we have estates not too far away. Giuliano, the younger brother, actually injured himself falling off a horse, and so couldn't attend the banquet. So they're like, oh, we got to wait. We got to get both of them. So then they're all back in Florence, and says, well, there's going to be a banquet at the Medici Palace. We could do it there. Well, that doesn't seem like such a great idea. And again, Giuliano is still recovering from his sprained ankle, not going to come down to the banquet. They go, oh, okay, what are we going to do? How about we know that they will leave the palace to go to church on Easter, right? Because they might not go any other Sunday, but we know they will go to church on Easter Sunday. So that was what they decided to do. And it sort of, this is part of the scandal and outrage of the Pazzi conspiracy. Anybody who's played Assassin's Creed, by the way, all of these people figure in the online game. The Francesco Pazzi and Salviati, I think, are both characters in Assassin's Creed. Anyway, so they go, okay, we know they'll go to church on Easter Sunday, so that will get them in the church. And of course, there are no pews in that era. Everybody stands while the service is being conducted, and everybody's having little huddles and side conversations and shaking hands, and not all that much attention is being paid to the celebration. But they need to make sure they strike both brothers at the same time. And the brothers have overlapping but slightly different circles of friends. So the two brothers are not going to be standing linked arms. They're going to be standing probably in different parts of the sanctuary, and they got to make sure that they launch their attacks simultaneously on both brothers, so they need a signal. They need a sound and something visual on Easter Sunday. So what they come up with is, well, when the priest who's celebrating Mass says the prayer of consecration over the bread and the wine, he turns his back to the congregation and he raises the bread. And at that moment, they ring the bells in the church and they go, that's when we strike. That'll be the signal. When you hear the bell, when you see the priest raise the bread, pull your daggers, And wherever you are, make sure you're standing close to Lorenzo and Giuliano and stab them. They had like 6 assassins. And so their Easter Sunday, the signal happens. They had 2 priests who were part of the conspiracy who were standing next to Giuliano. They pulled their daggers and stabbed him 17 times. And of course, he collapses. Lorenzo, they had slightly jumped the gun. Lorenzo turns at the noise, at the scuffle, at the disturbance, and he sees somebody coming at him with a dagger, but he's a split second behind the others. And so he manages to get an arm up and ward it off. He's actually wounded on his shoulder blade. And his friends all get around him. They defend him. They hustle him into a side room, manage to close the doors where the other 3 or 4 assassins can't get at them, and they hustle him out of the church and back to the palace. And of course, immediately, it's like wildfire. The news spreads. Giuliano, the younger brother, is lying on the floor of the cathedral in a pool of blood. And Lorenzo, the last they saw, he's bleeding and he is being hustled through the streets back to the palace. He has to show himself at a balcony of the palace to reassure the citizens, I'm okay. Everybody in town then goes looking for any member of the Pazzi family they can find, because they knew who the assassins were. Francesco and they're both Francescos. Francesco de Pazzi and Francesco Salviati were well known. They had been seen in the church as part of the assassins. They catch both of them, carry them into the city hall, tie ropes around their necks, and throw them off the roof. They actually hung 6 of the Pazzi from the town hall within an hour or 2 of the assassination attempt. Yeah, Francesco de Pazzi hung. Riario escaped. Francesco Salviati also hung. 3 assassins captured in the church hung. There were eventually 6 bodies hanging from the city hall. 80 members of the Pazzi family were executed in the streets of Florence within a matter of a couple of hours. And the family were expelled, and their palace and property were confiscated. The symbol of the Pazzi family was a dolphin. You cannot find a dolphin anywhere in Florence. It was outlawed. The Pope and the King of Naples declared war on Florence because they killed an archbishop. And they're like, well, but they tried to assassinate. No, you killed an archbishop. We're going to war. The Pope hired mercenaries from Siena and Lucca. The Duke of Urbino was hired to command them. The Pope excommunicated the Medici, renounced all debts owed to the Medici Bank, and threatened Florence with the interdict. The interdict is we're going to excommunicate the entire city. He said, you surrender Lorenzo to us, or we're going to excommunicate the entire city. We're going to forbid the performance of any of the sacraments. That's the interdict. So there were 18 months of war, but they're between mercenary armies. And you have to know something about the history of mercenary armies in Italy in the 15th century. There's a lot of maneuvering and very little fighting, because the mercenaries all know each other. And they're kind of like, okay, we're going to march over here, you march over there, and then we'll set up camp and we'll figure out what we do next. So there are no major battles over 18 months, but everybody's kind of jockeying for position and trying to bribe and suborn, and get the mercenary general of the other side to switch side. It's a mess. So finally, after about 18 months of war, Lorenzo says, we got to bring this to an end because all of these soldiers are costing us lots of money. You have to pay the wages of the mercenary army, or they might loot your own town. And so he actually sails to Naples, which is the city that they're at war with. But he knows the people there because he had previously in his teen years visited that court, visited that city. He is friends with the son of the King of Naples. And after some tense negotiation, over the course of 10 weeks, a peace treaty is agreed upon. The Pope is basically left in the lurch. The mercenaries go home. The Pope has to sort of throw up his hands and say, well, okay. And there is what follows then, after this brief war, after the assassination attempt, is about 10 or 15 years that is called then Florence's Golden Age. Lorenzo returns from Naples. He's perceived as having been both incredibly courageous and diplomatically very skilled in having ended this war, having survived the assassination attempt, having actually forced the Pope and the King of Naples to eventually come to terms, even though Florence had to give up some territory, had to pay some money, but we got peace. And that same year, here's the other thing that really means there's going to be peace amongst the cities of Italy. A large Turkish army landed at the southern tip of Italy and seized the port of Otranto. And that appeared to threaten Naples and possibly even Rome. And so all of a sudden everybody's going, wait a minute. Yeah, let's stop fighting each other because this looks like it could be serious. The Pope's mercenary army withdrew from Tuscany. The Tuscan towns that Lorenzo had to agree to let them to continue to occupy were then given back to Florence. The interdict by the Pope was lifted, and he said, come help me fight the Turks. And in 1484, he dies and is succeeded by a new pope, and the new pope is also a friend of Lorenzo's. And so now things go much better. He went out of his way to be kind and ingratiating to this pope. And throughout the 1480s, Lorenzo devotes himself to the peace of Italy. Lorenzo actually founds a school in Florence housed in the Medici Palace to educate and train young artists. And this is where we get the story of Michelangelo doing his first sculpture. As a student, a boarder, not just living in the Medici Palace, but he sits at the dining table with the Medici family. And Lorenzo's 3 sons are his friends. And it's one reason why Michelangelo goes on to be one of the great artists in Rome, the painter of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, because the Pope who commissions that is the Medici son of Lorenzo that he had grown up with. It's possible that another of the pupils at the Medici Palace was Leonardo da Vinci. We don't know it, but he's contemporary. And it's quite possible. We do know that when the Duke of Milan asked Lorenzo to recommend an artist, because the Duke of Milan was commissioning some major artwork, that Lorenzo actually recommended Leonardo and dispatched him to Milan. That's why we have the Last Supper, which is painted in a monastery in Milan. Lorenzo does something else that's very interesting and not as well appreciated as it should be. He sent purchasing agents to the Eastern Mediterranean, into some of the territory that was now controlled by the Turks, to search for and buy Greek manuscripts. Eventually, 200 manuscripts were brought back to Florence by his agents. And 100 of those were from Greek philosophers whose works had not been previously even known about. And so Ficino and the other scholars in Florence begin to work on translating these into Latin, and there's also a new means of distribution of these manuscripts and this learning from the ancient Greek world, and that is by the 1470s, by 1480, there's a printing press in Florence. Printing had started in Germany, Gutenberg, 1455. By the 1470s, there's a printing press in Florence and a printing press in Venice. Lorenzo was a patron of the University of Pisa and the University of Florence, and Florence University was known to be the only university in Europe where Greek was properly taught. It became a mecca for all the scholars of Europe. Lorenzo himself wrote volumes of poetry in a variety of styles. He wrote love poetry, he wrote humorous tales and sketches, he wrote lyrics to bawdy songs. We have volumes of his poetry. But by 1492, it's clear he's dying. He'd suffered from gout. which is a failure of the liver and kidneys and causes inflammation and pain in the joints. He's got worse. He develops a constant fever. He left for his country estate. His oldest son, Piero, remained in Florence working on the bank. He's the son that Lorenzo said was the stupid one, but he's the oldest. His second son, Giovanni, the clever one, had left for Rome to begin a career in the church. His youngest son, Giuliano, named for Lorenzo's brother, named for the brother who had been killed in the assassination attempt, remained with Lorenzo at the country estate. On April 8th, 1492, Lorenzo slipped into a coma and then stopped breathing. And this is just about 6 months before Christopher Columbus sighted land in the New World. The intersection is, I think, very intriguing. Lorenzo's buried in the family church, not the Duomo. There's a church right across the street from where their palace is. He's buried next to his brother who had been murdered in 1478, 14 years before. So his reputation at the end of his life, he's a Renaissance man in every sense of the word. He's one of the most remarkable figures of the Italian Renaissance. He's a patron of great artists. He himself is very learned and very conversant with styles of art and who the artists are. He's generous, wide interests, wide knowledge, very well read. His reputation as a masterful diplomat and a peacemaker. Very cultured, a multifaceted talent. He becomes the symbol of the Florentine Golden Age. And his death marked the end of an era. And let me just read you Christopher Hibbert's summation of him. There we go. If I could only put my hands on it. Well, I'll leave it for another. I'm out of time. It is 6:57. We are going to continue. Next month, in May, Albrecht Dürer, the Leonardo of the North, a great German artist in Nuremberg who had made a pilgrimage to Italy. And you see from his dates, 1471 to 1528, he overlaps both Lorenzo the Magnificent in Florence and also Martin Luther. So he, in fact, was conversant with and familiar with Martin Luther. A fascinating look at his life, travels, and enduring legacy. And then our final lecture of the spring in June will be on Queen Elizabeth I, 44-year reign, transformed England into a major world power, ushered in a golden age of literature, exploration, and cultural achievements in England. So, I hope that gave you a bit of an introduction, whet your appetite perhaps. There's a lot more about Lorenzo that could be said, but I hope you understand now why he's such an important figure. And we got a minute or two. If you've got any questions, I'll be happy to entertain and do my best to give answers. So what else would you like to know about Lorenzo?
Was his poetry good?
Actually, the poetry is quite good. Yeah. And he preferred Italian because he liked Dante. He rejected some of the humanist prejudice for writing in Latin, writing in classical Latin. He said, no, Dante is the master of the language. And so he wrote in Latin, and his poetry is good. I think it helps if you can read Italian, which I can't yet. I've been working on it because I want to read Dante in Italian. But everybody says, no, he was good. Yeah, and funny, and occasionally risque.
So he was, talented, funny, rich, popular. It's a good thing he was ugly too, or what?
Yeah, yeah. But he was spectacularly ugly. Yep.
In his mouth, it got him that nose
Oh, yeah. 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 You have to compensate for the nose somehow. All right. Well, thank you all for coming out on a Tuesday night. And I hope to see you again next month. We'll talk about Duryea.
Absolutely.
And I have a Duryea print that I will bring.